A dying German Shepherd puppy lay frozen beside an icy mountain road, too weak to cry, too cold to lift its head. Cars passed. No one stopped. Then, a retired Navy SEAL saw the collar around its neck, and the words scratched into the metal nearly broke him. He thought he was saving a helpless puppy from the snow. But before spring came, that same wounded little dog would be the only reason he lived. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe so more stories of kindness, loyalty, and second chances can find their way to you. Late winter rain had frozen over the Blue Ridge by dusk, turning the mountain road into a pale ribbon of glass beneath a sky the color of old steel. William "Will" Harper drove alone through that fading light with both hands on the wheel, though one hand would have been enough for a man like him. He was 59, tall and broad-shouldered, with the hard, weathered build of someone who had spent most of his life carrying weight without complaint. His hair was short and iron gray, his beard close-cropped and silver at the chin, and his blue eyes had the guarded calm of a man who noticed exits before faces. Years as a Navy SEAL had carved discipline into his bones, but grief had carved deeper. It had bent something inside him no enemy ever could. He lived alone now in a small cedar cabin outside Boone, North Carolina, where the pines leaned close and the neighbors knew better than to knock too often. His wife, Margaret, had been gone nearly a year. She had been a small, warm-hearted woman with auburn hair, soft brown eyes, and the kind of laugh that made strangers feel forgiven before they knew what they had done wrong. After she died, Will stopped going to Sunday suppers, stopped answering Charlotte Reed's invitations from the next farm, and stopped lighting the fireplace unless the cold became mean enough to threaten the pipes. A man could survive a cold house, he told himself. A warm one remembered too much. On the passenger seat lay an old folded jacket, faded navy camouflage, the cuffs worn thin. Beneath it, tucked into the crease of the leather, were 2 dog tags and a cracked black collar that had belonged to Ranger, his last K9. Ranger had been a large German Shepherd with a dark saddle coat, intelligent amber eyes, and a brave heart that never understood retreat. He had died in Will's arms during a mission Will still refused to describe. Since then, Will had carried the collar like a punishment. Some men kept medals. Will kept ghosts. The radio whispered weather warnings through static. Freezing rain. Closed secondary roads. Black ice past mile marker 17. Will listened without really listening. He had gone into town for lamp oil, coffee, and canned soup. Though he had forgotten the soup, Margaret would have teased him for that. She used to say he could memorize a mission map in 30 seconds but lose a grocery list between the truck and the store. The thought almost made him smile. Almost. Then he saw something near the ditch. At first it looked like a wet cloth snagged against a clump of frozen grass. A dark little shape, half buried where the plow had shoved dirty snow toward the shoulder. Will drove past it by 10 yards before his foot eased off the gas. The truck rolled forward. His jaw tightened. He looked in the rearview mirror. The shape did not move. "Keep driving," he muttered. The road was slick. Night was coming. Whatever it was not his problem. That was what the world had taught him lately. Keep moving. Keep quiet. Do not touch what might break your heart. But then a memory rose without permission. Margaret, standing in their kitchen, holding a wounded sparrow in a towel, looking up at him with those gentle eyes. "If it crosses your path, Will, maybe it was meant to," he cursed under his breath, pulled onto the shoulder, and stepped out into the freezing wind. The cold struck him hard, slipping under his collar and through his gloves. Trucks had passed this way already, their tires leaving brown slush along the road. Will walked back slowly, boots crunching over ice, and knelt beside the ditch. The dark shape gave the faintest tremble. It was a puppy, a German Shepherd, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, black and tan fur soaked flat against a body too thin to belong to anything young. Its ears were still soft and uneven, one folded sideways, the other twitching weakly against the sleet. Its ribs rose and fell so faintly that Will had to hold his breath to see it. Mud clung to its muzzle. One front paw was swollen, crusted with blood and road grit. Round its neck hung a leather collar far too large, dragging against the ice like a chain from another life. Will stared at it, and the old battlefield calm left him. "Easy," he whispered, though he did not know whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. The puppy did not lift its head. Its eyes were sealed halfway shut, lashes crusted with frost. Will reached out, expecting a flinch, maybe a weak snap of fear. Instead, the tiny creature leaned, barely, into his hand. That small surrender pierced him worse than any cry could have. It was the trust of something too exhausted to defend itself. A car came around the bend, headlights washing over him. It slowed for half a second, then moved on. Another followed. No one stopped. Will watched the red taillights disappear into the gray. The world was full of people in a hurry to get home, and somehow this little thing had no home at all. He slipped 2 fingers under the collar to loosen it. A small metal tag scraped against the buckle. Most of the words were scratched away, but when he tilted it toward the weak light, 4 letters struck him like a hand to the chest. Ranger's Last. Will went still. For a moment, the mountain, the road, the wind, even the cold disappeared. All he could see was another German shepherd years ago, heavier in his arms, blood warm against his sleeve, amber eyes looking up at him as if still waiting for a command. Ranger. His Ranger, the name he had buried but never escaped. The puppy shivered again, a fragile ripple passing through its body. Will pulled out his phone and tried the nearest veterinary clinic. Closed. He tried animal control. No answer. He tried the emergency line listed on an old roadside sign. The call failed twice before a recording told him winter road conditions had delayed services in the county. He looked toward the darkening ridge, then back at the puppy. Snow had begun to fall again, soft at first, then thicker. "You picked a bad road, little one," he said, his voice rough. The puppy made no sound. Its breath fogged once against the ice and nearly vanished. Will stood there another second, fighting the wall he had spent a year building around himself. He knew what happened when he cared. He knew what the bill came to. Love came like fire, warmed the hands, lit the room, then left ashes deep enough to bury a man. But the puppy's paw twitched against his boot, weak and pleading, and something ancient in him answered before fear could stop it. He stripped off the old Navy jacket from the truck, wrapped the puppy inside, and lifted it carefully against his chest. It weighed almost nothing. Too little. Too late, maybe, but still warm somewhere beneath the cold warm. Will carried it back to the truck, opened the passenger door, and laid it where the ghosts had been. The cracked black collar slid to the floor at his feet. He turned the heater high, then looked down at the small, bundled body fighting for each breath. "No one gets left behind," he whispered. Then he drove toward the cabin as the mountain road disappeared behind a curtain of snow, and the scratched tag in his pocket seemed to burn with the unfinished question. Ranger's last what? The cabin waited in darkness beneath the frozen pines, its windows black, its chimney cold, and its silence deep enough to swallow the sound of Will's truck climbing the gravel drive. Will Harper parked crookedly beside the porch, though he was a man who had once aligned boats in black water by moonless instinct. Tonight, his hands were not steady. The bundled puppy on the passenger seat had not made a sound for the last mile, and that quiet frightened him more than any gunfire ever had. He shut off the engine, but left the heater running for 1 extra second, as if that weak blast of warmth were some sacred bridge between life and death. "Hold on," he whispered, leaning over the small shape wrapped in the faded Navy jacket. "We're here." The German shepherd puppy lay limp inside the cloth, its black and tan fur soaked flat, one soft ear folded against its head, the other stiff with frost. Its muzzle was narrow and young, still rounded with baby softness, though hunger had sharpened it too soon. The swollen front paw twitched once, barely, like a candle flame feeling the wind. Will slipped the scratched tag into his coat pocket, where the unfinished words seemed to press against his ribs. Rangers last. He did not know what the rest meant. He did not know if he wanted to know, but he knew one thing with the clean, brutal certainty of an order given under fire. If he left this puppy in the cold another minute, there would be no mystery left to solve. He carried the puppy up the porch steps against his chest. The old boards groaned beneath his boots, the same way they had groaned when Margaret used to step outside with 2 mugs of coffee and scold him for pretending he did not need a scarf. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old cedar, and the faint bitterness of a man who had forgotten how to live among living things. The fireplace was dark. The kitchen sink held 1 mug, 1 plate, 1 knife. A gray blanket lay over Margaret's rocking chair because Will had not been able to look at the empty seat without feeling something claw up his throat. He stood just inside the doorway with the puppy in his arms and felt, for the first time in months, ashamed of the cold. "Sorry, boy," he muttered, though the word boy came before he knew the puppy's sex, before he knew anything except that it was small and hurt and trusting him with a life he did not feel worthy to hold. Will moved quickly then. Old training woke inside him like a stern sergeant. Assess, warm, stabilize, do not panic. Panic was for later, if later came. He laid the puppy on a thick towel near the hearth, then knelt with a stiffness that reminded him he was 59 and no longer built of iron, only scar tissue and stubbornness. He brought kindling from the box, stacked it with careful hands, and struck a match. The first flame trembled, thin and orange, then caught the dry wood. When the fire began to crackle, the sound startled him. It filled the room with a voice the house had not had in a long time. Will fetched towels from the linen closet. The good ones Margaret had folded with lavender sachets between them. He hesitated before using them. Then he looked at the puppy's shallow breathing and cursed himself for being sentimental over cloth when a life was fading on his floor. He dried the pup gently, rubbing along its ribs, careful with the injured paw. Under the wet fur, the little body was heartbreakingly thin. The puppy could not have weighed more than 15 pounds, perhaps less, all bones and cold and stubborn breath. Its eyes fluttered once, cloudy with exhaustion, then closed again. Will filled a hot water bottle, wrapped it in a towel, and placed it near the puppy's belly, not too close, remembering some old field medic lesson about warming the body too fast. He stripped off his flannel overshirt and tucked it around the small animal, then pulled Margaret's old quilt from the back of the sofa. The quilt was faded blue and cream, stitched with tiny uneven squares because Margaret had always claimed perfection made handmade things lonely. Will had not touched it since the funeral. Now he laid it over the puppy and felt a strange terror, as if by saving this creature he had invited memory to sit beside him again. He tried calling the emergency veterinary number again. The phone rang twice, then failed. He tried the county animal line. A recorded voice spoke cheerfully about office hours, as if death respected calendars. Will lowered the phone and stared at the puppy. "All right," he said, voice hoarse. "Then it's you and me until morning." In the kitchen, he warmed a little water and mixed a weak bit of honey into it, not knowing if it was right, only knowing sugar and warmth had dragged men back from shock before. He found an old plastic syringe in a drawer, left from the time Margaret had bottle-fed an orphaned kitten she found under the church steps. Margaret Harper had been the kind of woman who believed every broken thing deserved a name before it deserved a grave. Will could almost hear her now. Not too much, Will. Slow. Let him choose to swallow. The memory was so clear it made him look over his shoulder, but the kitchen was empty. Only the fire answered, snapping softly behind him. He returned to the hearth and lifted the puppy's head with 2 fingers. "Easy," he whispered, "just a little." Most of the warm water slipped down the side of the puppy's muzzle. Will wiped it away with a corner of the towel and tried again. This time, the tiny tongue moved. Once, barely, but enough. Will let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like a year. "There you go," he said, and the gentleness in his own voice frightened him. He had spent months hardening himself into a stone, because stones did not miss wives, did not dream of dying dogs, did not wake before dawn reaching for someone who was no longer there. Yet here he was, kneeling on the floor, coaxing a half-frozen puppy to swallow drops of sweet water like an old priest offering communion to a fallen angel with muddy paws. Hours crawled by. Outside, the storm thickened, pressing snow against the windows until the world beyond the glass disappeared. Will kept the fire alive. He changed the towels when they grew damp. He warmed the water bottle again and again. The puppy breathed unevenly, sometimes fast, sometimes so slowly that Will leaned down with his ear near its nose. Each time he felt the faint brush of air, he thanked a God he had not spoken to properly since Margaret's hospital room. He did not ask for much. Not forgiveness, not peace, not even understanding. Only this: let the little thing last until morning. Somewhere near midnight, he found himself talking. At first it was nonsense, the rough murmuring of a lonely man trying to keep silence from becoming a second storm. Then the words turned into stories. He told the puppy about Margaret's terrible garden tomatoes, which grew small as marbles but were praised as if they had won medals. He told it about the time his old K9 Ranger stole an entire ham from a church picnic and looked offended when accused. He even smiled at that, a cracked, reluctant smile, but real enough to hurt. The puppy stirred once when he said Ranger. Will noticed. His hand froze over the quilt. The old black collar lay on the coffee table nearby, its cracked leather dull in the firelight. The new tag remained in his pocket, carrying its unfinished message like a riddle sent by a cruel but careful angel. Will rubbed his thumb over the puppy's small head. "That name doesn't belong to anybody anymore," he said softly. "Or maybe it belongs to too many." He leaned back against the armchair, knees aching, eyes burning. He had not allowed himself to say his old dog's name aloud in months. Names were dangerous. Names opened doors. Names made the dead sit up in memory and look at you with patient eyes. But the puppy breathed again, a tiny, shuddering pull beneath the quilt, and Will felt the name rise in him like a match struck in a cave. Then, without warning, the puppy's body jerked. A small tremor ran through its legs, then another. Will sat forward sharply. "Hey! Hey! Stay with me!" The puppy's jaw tightened. Its swollen paw curled, and its whole body gave one weak convulsion before going terribly still. The cabin seemed to stop with it. No wind, no fire, no old timbers settling in the cold. Will placed his hand on the puppy's ribs. Nothing moved. His own heartbeat thundered so loudly he could not tell if he was feeling the dog or himself. "No," he whispered. The word broke apart in his mouth. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the tiny chest, searching. "Don't do this. Don't make me lose another one." There it was, stripped bare at last. Not command, not training, not the old seal vow that no one got left behind. Just a grieving man on the floor of a cold cabin, begging a half-frozen puppy not to become another body he had failed to keep warm. For several seconds, there was nothing. Will bowed his head and the room blurred. Then beneath his fingertips, so faint it could have been imagined, came one small beat, a pause, another, weak, stubborn, uneven, alive. Will closed his eyes and something inside him cracked wide enough for warmth to enter. "There you are," he breathed. "There you are, Ranger." He did not plan to say it. Once spoken, the name settled over the puppy like part of the quilt, like a promise made before witnesses no one else could see. Not a replacement for the dog he had lost. Not a trick to bring back what war and death had taken. A new Ranger. A last Ranger, maybe. A small soul with a broken tag and a fighting heart. Will lifted the puppy carefully and held him against his chest, feeling that fragile pulse through the towel. He talked until his throat went rough. He told Ranger about Margaret, about the old K9, about the Blue Ridge in spring when the hills turned green and the creeks sang like children running downhill. He told him that if morning came they would figure out the rest. Outside, snow buried the road, erased the tire tracks, softened the hard edges of the world. Inside, the fire burned steadily for the first time in months. The cabin was still quiet, but not empty. Near dawn, Ranger gave a tiny sigh and pressed his nose, cold and damp, against Will's shirt. Will looked down, eyes wet, and whispered, "All right, little soldier. We'll fight one more hour." And for the first time since Margaret's death, William Harper did not feel like the last living thing in the house. Morning came without mercy, pale and hard against the cabin windows, and the Blue Ridge lay buried beneath a skin of ice that made every pine branch look carved from glass. Will Harper had not slept. He sat on the floor beside the hearth with his back against the old armchair, one hand resting near Ranger's blanket, the other still curled around the dog tags hanging from his neck. The fire had burned low to a red glow, but he had kept it alive all night like a sentry guarding the last gate before darkness. Ranger had survived until dawn, but survival did not look like victory. The German Shepherd puppy lay too still beneath Margaret's quilt, his small black and tan body trembling in uneven waves. His breathing had changed in the gray hour before sunrise, no longer faint and soft, but rough, wet, and strained. Each inhale dragging through his tiny chest like wind through a broken reed. Will leaned close and felt a cold fear move through him. The puppy's nose was dry. His gums looked pale. The swollen front paw had turned redder overnight, the skin tight beneath the muddy fur, and when Will brushed 2 fingers near it, Ranger gave a thin sound that barely counted as a whimper. "I know," Will whispered. "I know, son. I'm sorry." He tried to offer a few drops of warm water again, but Ranger turned his head away. That simple refusal frightened Will more than the convulsion had. A creature fighting to live would swallow anything. A creature slipping away stopped asking the world for help. Will stood too quickly, and pain flashed through his knees. He ignored it, went to the kitchen counter, and grabbed his phone. The emergency veterinary number rang long enough for him to imagine the whole town sleeping under snow. Then a woman answered, her voice alert but low, as if she had been awake before the phone knew to ring. Brooks Veterinary Clinic. Will closed his eyes for half a second. "This is William Harper, up near Elk Hollow Road. I found a German Shepherd puppy last night. Hypothermic, injured paw, barely breathing. He made it through the night, but now he's worse. He won't eat, and his breathing sounds wet." There was a pause. Not hesitation, but calculation. "How old?" she asked. 8, maybe 9 weeks? Color in the gums? Pale. Any vomiting? Seizures? A small seizure last night. No vomiting. "Bring him in now," she said. "Wrap him warm, but don't overheat him. Keep his head clear. Drive slow if the road is iced. I'll be waiting." Her name, she told him, was Dr. Emma Brooks. Her voice had the firm steadiness of a woman who did not waste panic, and that steadiness became a rope thrown across a ravine. Will hung up, tucked the phone into his coat, and looked back at Ranger. "You hear that? We got orders." He moved with the old precision again, but the man beneath it was unraveling. He warmed a clean towel by the fire, wrapped Ranger in the faded navy jacket, then added Margaret's quilt around the outside, careful not to press the injured paw. Ranger's head lolled against his wrist, too heavy for something so small. Will remembered another head, larger, blood-wet, resting in the same helpless angle across his forearm. His old K9 Ranger had been strong enough to pull a grown man down, smart enough to read Will's silence, loyal enough to follow him into places no living thing should have been asked to enter. Yet, in the end, Will had carried him too, whispering promises that arrived too late. He shoved the memory down, but it rose again like smoke. "Not this time," he said, and the words came out almost angry. "You don't get to leave before I know who you are." Outside, the mountain had turned hostile. Freezing rain had glazed the porch steps, and the snow swept sideways through the trees. Will placed Ranger on the passenger seat, securing the bundle with one arm of the quilt so the puppy would not roll with the turns. He started the truck and waited only long enough for the windshield to clear a fist-sized patch. The heater groaned. The wipers scraped against ice. As he backed down the drive, the cabin disappeared behind him, its chimney giving off the first true smoke it had made in months. For one strange moment, Will thought the house looked alive again, like an old beast breathing in its sleep. The road down from Elk Hollow twisted along the ridge, narrow and mean, with a ditch on one side and a steep drop on the other. Will had driven worse roads under worse skies, but those roads had belonged to missions, and missions had rules. This was different. There was no team beside him, no command in his ear, no clean objective except keeping a puppy's chest moving from 1 mile marker to the next. Ranger made a faint rasping sound, and Will reached over without taking his eyes off the road. "Come on, son," he said. "Stay with me. We're not home yet. Not really." The phrase surprised him. Home. He had not used that word honestly since Margaret died. The cabin had been shelter, storage, a place to keep his body out of the rain. But with Ranger wrapped beside him, fragile and breathing, Will felt the word shift, painful and small, like a seed under frost. Halfway down the mountain, the truck hit black ice. The rear wheels slid left, then right, and the world tilted toward the guardrail. Will's body reacted before thought could catch up. He eased off the brake, turned into the skid, hands steady by training though his heart tore against his ribs. The truck fishtailed, tires whining, then caught hard enough to throw him forward against the seatbelt. Ranger's bundle shifted. Will grabbed him with one hand and pulled him back from the edge of the seat. The truck stopped at an angle, nose pointed toward the white emptiness beyond the road. For several seconds, Will sat frozen, breath loud in the cab. Then Ranger whimpered, small and offended by the universe. Will laughed once, a broken sound. "That's right," he said, touching the puppy's head. "Complain. Complaining means you're alive." When he finally reached Boone, the town looked half erased by weather. Storefronts were dark, sidewalks glazed, church steps buried under snow. Brooks Veterinary Clinic sat near the edge of town in a low brick building with a green metal roof and one yellow light glowing above the entrance. 2 figures stood under the awning. Dr. Emma Brooks was in her early 50s, tall and lean, with fair skin weathered by mountain winters, sharp hazel eyes, and silver-streaked chestnut hair pulled into a practical knot at the back of her neck. She wore a white coat over a thick navy sweater, jeans tucked into rubber boots, and her expression carried that rare mixture of tenderness and command found in people who had watched life leave a room and still chosen to keep entering rooms. Beside her stood Henry Brooks, her 17-year-old nephew, a lanky boy with the sandy blonde hair falling over his forehead, pale freckled skin, and anxious green eyes that made him look younger whenever he was frightened. He wore an oversized clinic hoodie and moved with the awkwardness of a teenager still growing into his bones, but when he saw the bundle in Will's arms, his face changed from sleepy resentment to quiet concern. Emma opened the door before Will reached it. "Exam room 2, she said. No greeting, no wasted breath. Will liked her immediately for that. The clinic smelled of antiseptic, wet wool, and animal fear, but it was warm. Emma laid Ranger on a padded table under a heat lamp while Henry rushed to bring towels. "Body temperature is low," she said after the thermometer beeped. "Very low. Dehydration, possible aspiration or early pneumonia, and that paw is infected." Her hands moved quickly but gently over Ranger's body, checking gums, ribs, pulse, lungs. Ranger barely reacted. Will stood near the table with his shoulders squared, but inside him every word landed like a stone. "Can you save him?" Emma looked up at him. She did not offer the false mercy of easy answers. "I can fight for him," she said, "but he has to fight too." Henry set down a small oxygen mask and Emma nodded approval. "Good. Warm saline, small dose, not too fast." Henry swallowed hard. "Aunt Emma, his breathing. I hear it." Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened. She placed the mask over Ranger's muzzle. The puppy's chest rose once, twice, then hitched. Will saw it before anyone said it. The rhythm stopped. Emma leaned in. "Henry, stimulate. Now." The boy rubbed Ranger's side with a towel while Emma adjusted the oxygen and pressed 2 fingers carefully near the puppy's tiny chest. Not dramatic, not frantic, just precise as prayer. Will's hand closed around the dog tags at his neck until the metal bit into his palm. In that moment, he was no longer a SEAL, no longer a man who had survived gunfire, storms, and grief with his jaw locked shut. He was only an old soldier watching another Ranger drift toward a door he could not breach. "Come on," Emma murmured. "Not yet, little one." Henry's face had gone pale. Will wanted to speak but could not find the road between his heart and his mouth. Then Ranger's body gave the smallest jerk. A thin breath entered him, weak and ragged, but real. Another followed. Emma held still for 1 second, listening through her stethoscope, then exhaled. "He's back," Henry whispered. "Thank God." Will looked down at his shaking hand and only then realized the dog tags were trembling because he was. Ranger lay beneath the oxygen mask, impossibly small under the clinic light, still balanced between worlds but breathing. Will stepped closer and rested 2 fingers lightly against the puppy's blanket. "Good boy," he said, his voice breaking in a way he would have hated yesterday. "That's it. You keep coming back." Emma glanced at him, and something in her expression softened, but she said nothing. The storm beat against the windows. The yellow clinic light held, and on the table before them the puppy named Ranger pulled one more breath into his fragile chest. Snow kept falling over Boone through the night, softening the streets, burying tire tracks, and pressing the whole town beneath a white silence that felt almost holy. Will Harper did not leave the clinic. Dr. Emma Brooks told him there was a folding chair in the hallway, a coffee pot in the back room, and a motel 2 blocks down if he had sense enough to use it. Will used none of them properly. He sat beside the examination room door with his elbows on his knees, his gray head bowed, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold long before midnight. Every hour, Emma came out to give him some small piece of news. Ranger's temperature had risen 1/2 degree. Ranger had tolerated a little warm fluid. Ranger was still breathing with help from oxygen. Ranger was not safe yet. That last sentence returned again and again like a crow tapping the window. Not safe yet. Will had spent a lifetime living inside danger, but this was different. Danger used to have shape: a door, a ridge, a dark alley, a hostile face in bad light. This danger was hidden inside a puppy's lungs, inside a swollen paw, inside the small chest of a creature that weighed less than Will's old field pack. Near dawn, Henry Brooks found him still awake. The boy had changed out of his hoodie and into a clean flannel shirt under a clinic vest, though his sandy hair still stuck up in tired tufts. He carried a fresh coffee and a vending machine honey bun like offerings brought to a wounded king. "Aunt Emma says you should eat," Henry said. Will looked up. Henry's face was pale with exhaustion, but there was something earnest in him now, something steadier than the nervous teenager from the night before. "Your aunt always give the orders?" Will asked. "Mostly to people who need them." Will almost smiled. He took the coffee but left the honey bun untouched. "How's he look to you?" Henry glanced through the glass window into the treatment room, where Ranger slept under the heat lamp, wrapped in clean towels, oxygen tubing near his muzzle. "Small," he said honestly. Then, after a moment, "but mad about it." This time, Will did smile, faintly. "Good. Mad keeps a body here." Emma called him in after sunrise. She had removed her white coat and rolled up the sleeves of her navy sweater, revealing strong forearms marked with old scratches from animals that had not appreciated medical care. Under the fluorescent light, her hazel eyes looked even sharper, but they were kind, too, in the guarded way of people who had learned kindness needed armor. Ranger lay on the padded table, still weak, but no longer as limp as a rag in winter water. His black and tan fur had dried into soft, uneven fluff, one ear still folded sideways, giving him the look of a tiny soldier wearing a helmet wrong. His injured paw was cleaned and lightly wrapped, though the swelling remained angry beneath the bandage. Will stepped closer, afraid to hope too loudly. "He made it?" Emma wiped her hands on a towel. He made it through the night. That is not the same thing as made it. Will nodded. He appreciated truth, even when it tasted like iron. Emma reached for the old collar lying in a stainless steel tray. It looked worse in daylight. Cracked brown leather, rusted buckle, dried mud in the holes, and a metal tag scratched nearly blank on one side. "I cleaned this up while he was resting," she said. "You saw the front." Will touched the edge of the tray. "Rangers last." "There's more on the back." She turned the tag carefully beneath the light. The letters were faint, but visible now, carved shallow and worn by weather. "Last pup of K9 Ranger." For a second, Will heard nothing. The clinic vanished. The beeping monitor softened into a memory of distant rotors, shouting men, and a German shepherd's last breath against his sleeve. Emma watched him, reading more than he wanted written on his face. "Will," she said gently, "this may not be your ranger." He swallowed. "I know that," but his voice betrayed him. Emma set the collar down. Henry found an old breeder stamp on the inside leather. Blue Ridge Working Dogs. Small outfit about 40 miles west. They used to train shepherds for search and rescue units, sheriff departments, some private handlers. Closed down last year after the owner died. I don't know the whole story yet. Will stared at the sleeping puppy. "And the chip?" Emma picked up a handheld scanner from the counter. "There is one, but it barely reads. Damaged or defective. The number comes through incomplete, and the registry has no active owner attached. Could be old paperwork. Could be someone cleared it. Could be nobody cared enough to update it." Henry, standing near the supply shelf, looked angry in that clean young way of someone not yet used to the world's ugliness. "Who leaves a puppy on an ice road?" he asked. Emma's mouth tightened. "Someone who convinced themselves it wasn't their problem." Will looked at Ranger's tiny chest rising under the towel. "A lot of people are good at that." The words hit harder because he knew they could have belonged to him. Last night, for 10 yards, he had kept driving. 10 yards was not far, but in his mind it had become a canyon. He imagined those other cars passing, headlights sliding over a dying puppy, drivers thinking of groceries, warm kitchens, television noise, all the ordinary kingdoms of people who still belonged somewhere. He had nearly joined them. Margaret would have known. His old ranger would have known. Maybe the little creature on the table had known too, and forgiven him before he deserved it. Emma moved beside him and adjusted the IV line. "There's something else," she said. "If he's truly from that line, he may have been the last litter from a working K9 named Ranger. The old facility's records might tell us more, but not today. Today, he needs warmth, antibiotics, careful feeding, and rest." Will nodded slowly. "Can I take him home?" Emma gave him a look. "You can, but you have to understand what that means. Feedings every few hours. Keep him warm. Watch the breathing. Watch the paw. If the infection spreads or he stops eating, you bring him back immediately. And, Will..." She paused until he met her eyes. "Don't build your whole heart around him yet. Puppies this sick can break your heart even when everyone does everything right." He looked down at Ranger, at the folded ear, the 2 large paws, the bandage already too white for a world that had treated him so poorly. "Doc," he said quietly, that warning came too late. By late afternoon, the storm had weakened into a cold silver mist. Emma sent Will home with puppy formula, antibiotics, a syringe, printed instructions, extra towels, and Henry's handwritten feeding schedule, decorated with arrows, underlines, and one small drawing of a shepherd head wearing a heroic cape. Will raised an eyebrow at it. Henry flushed. "It helps me remember which page is important." "Sure," Will said. "Tactical cape." Henry grinned for the first time since Will had met him. Emma carried Ranger to the truck herself, the puppy wrapped in a clean blue blanket that made him look even smaller. "No cow's milk, no big meals, no letting him wander," she said, "and call me if anything changes." "You sleep at all?" Will asked. Emma gave him a dry smile. "Veterinarians are mythical creatures. We run on coffee, guilt, and unpaid invoices." It was a small joke, but it warmed something in the parking lot air. Will thanked her, though the words felt too thin for what she had done. Then he drove back up the mountain with Ranger breathing beside him, each small exhale fogging the edge of the blanket like proof written on glass. The cabin looked different when he returned. Not better exactly, but less abandoned, as if the smoke from last night's fire had announced to the trees that someone inside had resumed belonging to the earth. Will carried Ranger in, laid him near the hearth, and built the fire higher than before. He followed Emma's instructions with soldierly seriousness. Medicine measured, formula warmed, blanket changed, paw kept dry. Ranger swallowed 3 small mouthfuls before sleep took him again. Will sat back on his heels, exhausted enough to feel hollow, and looked around the room. The dishes still needed washing. Dust still lay on Margaret's rocking chair. The silence was still there, but now it had to make room for breathing. A knock came just after dusk. Will stiffened. Nobody came up his road in weather like this unless something was wrong, or they were Charlotte Reed. It was Charlotte Reed. She stood on the porch holding a covered pot against her hip and a canvas bag over one arm. Charlotte was 64, short and sturdy, with round shoulders made strong by years of farm work, soft gray-blonde hair pinned in a loose bun, bright blue eyes that missed very little, and freckled hands that had delivered casseroles, held grieving neighbors, and once smacked a raccoon off her chicken feed with a broom. She had been widowed 8 years, and widowhood had not made her bitter. It had made her practical, which was more dangerous. "William Harper," she said when he opened the door, "half the town can see smoke from your chimney 3 nights straight, and nobody knows whether to celebrate or call the sheriff." Will looked at the pot. "That for me or the sheriff?" "Depends on whether you let me in." He stepped aside. Charlotte entered with the confidence of someone who had known Margaret and therefore considered the cabin partly under her jurisdiction. She saw Ranger by the fire and stopped. Her face changed instantly, the teasing fading into a tenderness so quick and maternal it made Will look away. "Oh, mercy," she whispered. "So that's the reason for the light." She set the pot down, then pulled clean blankets and puppy formula from the bag. "Emma called me. Said you might pretend you didn't need help." Will grunted. "Emma talks too much." Men who live alone say that about women who save them trouble. Charlotte moved around the kitchen as if the house had been waiting for her permission to be useful again. She put soup on the stove, rinsed the old mug in the sink, and opened curtains Will had left closed for months. Blue evening light entered the room. Will almost told her to stop. Almost. But Ranger slept through it all, his tiny body rising and falling beside the fire, and the cabin seemed to breathe with him. Charlotte stood near Margaret's rocking chair, touching the gray blanket draped over it. "She would be glad," she said softly. Will's throat tightened. "Don't." Charlotte nodded, respecting the edge but not retreating from the truth. "All right. I'll only say this then. We've missed seeing a light up here." Will looked at Ranger. The puppy shifted in his sleep, nose twitching, one bandaged paw resting outside the blanket like a small white flag that had refused surrender. "He needs light," Will said. His voice was low, almost embarrassed by its own gentleness. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, but she did not smile. She understood too much to smile. Will kept his eyes on the fire, on the dog, on the fragile glow filling the room where grief had ruled like an old winter king. "That's all," he whispered. But somewhere beneath the words, as the soup warmed and the curtains stayed open, another truth stirred quietly beside the flames. So did he. 3 weeks passed, and winter loosened its fist only enough to make the Blue Ridge mud meaner beneath the snow, while inside Will Harper's cabin, life returned in small, stubborn sounds. Ranger did not heal like a miracle descending from heaven in one golden flash. He healed like a candle that refused to die in a draft. Some mornings, the German Shepherd puppy drank 3 full syringes of formula and blinked up at Will with clearer brown eyes, one ear still tipping sideways like it had lost an argument with gravity. Other mornings, he slept so deeply that Will had to kneel beside him and count the small rise and fall of his ribs before he dared breathe himself. The cabin learned a rhythm around him. At 6, Will warmed formula in a mug of hot water and tested it against his wrist the way Emma had shown him. At 7, he cleaned the bandaged paw. At 8, he added wood to the fire. At noon, he measured medicine with the seriousness of a man preparing explosives. By evening, he sat on the floor with his back against the sofa, Ranger bundled near his knee, telling stories to a puppy too young to understand words but wise enough perhaps to understand tone. The strange thing was how quickly the house accepted this new ceremony. The sink stayed clean, the curtains stayed open. Margaret's rocking chair no longer looked like a throne for grief, but like a chair waiting patiently beside the fire. Will still talked to Margaret, but now the words did not fall into an empty room. "You'd laugh at me," he murmured one night, watching Ranger paw clumsily at a loose thread in the quilt. "A Navy SEAL, taken hostage by 15 pounds of fur and bad manners." Ranger sneezed, startled himself, then tried to crawl backward and bumped into Will's boot. Will laughed before he could stop it. The sound came rough, unused, like an old engine turning after years in a barn. Ranger looked up at him, offended, then did something that stopped the laugh in Will's throat. He leaned forward and licked the back of Will's hand. It was tiny, warm, uncertain. A blessing disguised as puppy spit. Will froze. No medal had ever undone him that way, no speech, no folded flag, no handshake from a commander. Just one wounded little creature choosing, for half a second, to trust him. But the paw would not heal. The rest of Ranger began to wake, the eyes brighter, the breathing softer, the appetite returning in brave little gulps. But the front paw stayed angry. Will cleaned it twice a day, sometimes 3 times when he could not stop worrying. The swelling rose and fell like a bad rumor. The skin near one small toe darkened at the edge, first a faint purple, then gray, then a color that made Will look away and look back again, because denial had never saved anything. He called Emma almost every evening. At first, she told him to keep watching it, keep it dry, keep the antibiotics steady. Then, one afternoon, when the sleet had become a cold mist and Ranger yelped as Will touched the bandage, Emma's voice changed. "Bring him in, Will." She did not sound frightened. That made it worse. Will wrapped Ranger in the blue clinic blanket, tucked him inside his coat, and drove down the mountain with a carefulness that felt like prayer. Ranger rested against his ribs, warmer now than he had been that first night, but trembling with pain. Brooks' veterinary clinic smelled the same as before: antiseptic, coffee, wet boots, and hope trying not to show its fear. Henry was cleaning kennels when Will walked in, taller somehow after only 3 weeks, though still all elbows and worried eyes. "Hey, Ranger," he said softly, crouching near the blanket. "Still wearing the cape?" Will glanced at the boy. "He outranks you now." Henry smiled, but it faded when Ranger whimpered. Emma came from the back room wearing her white coat over a green flannel shirt, her silver-streaked hair pinned loosely, a pencil tucked behind one ear like a weapon of organized women everywhere. She examined the paw under a bright lamp. The room went quiet, except for Ranger's thin breathing. When Emma finally straightened, her face held the kind of sorrow that did not soften the truth. "The infection damaged the blood supply to part of this toe," she said. "That tissue is dying." Will's jaw tightened. "How much?" "A very small portion, but if we leave it, it can spread into the paw. Then we risk the leg, maybe worse." Henry looked down. Will kept his eyes on Emma. "You're saying cut it off." "I'm saying remove what can no longer be saved so the rest of him has a chance." Will turned toward Ranger. The puppy lay on the towel, exhausted, trusting, too young to know that life sometimes demanded payment even after survival. "He's been through enough." Emma's voice softened, not weakly, but with a steadiness that made the words land deeper. "Sometimes mercy is not keeping everything whole, Will. Sometimes mercy is saving what remains." The sentence followed him into the hallway when Emma prepared for the minor procedure. She told him it would be quick, that Ranger would not feel pain, that the tissue was already beyond saving. Will nodded like a soldier receiving instructions, but when the door closed, he became only a man in a narrow hallway with nowhere to put his hands. He stood beneath a framed poster about heartworm prevention and stared at a crack in the floor tile as if it contained military intelligence. Behind the door, he heard Emma's calm voice, Henry's quieter responses, the soft clink of instruments. He did not hear Ranger cry. That should have comforted him. Instead, it opened a drawer in memory he had kept locked. He saw the old Ranger again, not as the legend in his mind, but as he had been at the end. Heavy, brave, confused by pain, still trying to lift his head when Will said his name. Then Margaret, small in the hospital bed, fingers thin around his, telling him not to let sorrow turn him into a house with no windows. He had failed at that too, for a while, maybe longer than a while. Will pressed the dog tags against his palm until the edges hurt. He wanted one clean enemy to fight. A man could face an enemy. But grief came like weather, infection came like rot, time came like a thief with soft shoes. The door opened before he was ready. Emma stepped out, removing her gloves. "It's done," she said. "He did well." Will swallowed. "How much?" "Less than I feared. He'll limp for a while, maybe always a little, but he still has the paw, and the spread should stop now." Henry appeared behind her carrying the blue blanket, his face solemn but relieved. "He's waking up," the boy said. "And he looks mad again." Will closed his eyes. "Good." Ranger came home that evening with a fresh white bandage, new medication, and stricter instructions. No wandering, no rough movement. Watch for swelling. Keep him warm, keep him dry. Will listened to every word and wrote half of it down even though Emma had printed the same list. He did not trust memory any more. Memory had a way of turning noble in hindsight and useless in crisis. Back at the cabin, he placed Ranger near the fire and sat beside him until midnight. The puppy slept hard, his bandaged paw tucked awkwardly beneath his chin. Will could not stop looking at the place where something had been taken. It was such a small loss, a piece no bigger than the end of a man's thumb, and yet the sight of it carried the weight of all missing things. A wife's laugh, a dog's bark, a younger man's certainty. The years before silence moved into the walls. Near dawn, Ranger stirred. Will reached for him, expecting weakness. Instead, the puppy pushed himself up, wobbled, and fell sideways into the quilt. "Easy," Will said, moving to help. Ranger ignored him with the offended dignity of a tiny warrior king. He tried again. One paw forward, the bandaged paw down, a stumble, a soft thud, then another attempt. Will sat frozen, afraid his help would insult the effort. Ranger rose, trembling, and took 2 uneven steps across the rug. His body tilted, corrected, tilted again. Then he made it all the way to Will's boot and placed the white-wrapped paw on the worn leather, as if claiming the mountain after a battle no one else had seen. Will covered his mouth. The laugh came first, broken and bright. Then the tears. He had not cried when the old Ranger died, not properly. He had not cried at Margaret's funeral until everyone left, and even then he had done it like a man ashamed of rain. But now, with the bandaged puppy leaning against his boot, stubborn as sunrise, Will let the grief and joy rise together until he could no longer tell one from the other. "Look at you," he whispered, "missing a piece and still marching." Ranger looked up at him, eyes cloudy with sleep, tail giving one weak tap against the floor. Will bent down and rested his forehead near the puppy's small head. In that quiet, with the fire glowing and morning just beginning to silver the windows, he understood something he had spent years refusing to learn. Healing was not a return. It was not the world handing back what war, sickness, and winter had taken. Healing was learning the new weight of the body, the new shape of the heart, the new way to cross a room when one part of you would never come back. Ranger had lost a piece of his paw, but not his will. Will had lost pieces no doctor could name, but maybe not all of himself. The puppy pressed closer, warm and alive. Outside, the ice on the porch began to drip, one slow drop at a time, as if the mountain itself had decided to thaw. Winter had not finished with the Blue Ridge. It returned that evening with a cruel little laugh, laying fresh ice over the porch steps and turning every branch into a silver hook. By then, Ranger had been home from the clinic for several days, and though the German Shepherd puppy was still small enough to sleep inside the crook of Will Harper's arm, something fierce had begun to live behind his eyes. His bandaged paw remained tender, wrapped in clean white gauze that made him walk like a tiny veteran returning from a war no puppy should have known, but he had learned the cabin's rhythms with a soldier's seriousness. When Will warmed formula, Ranger lifted his head. When the medicine bottle clicked open, Ranger gave him a look of betrayal so dramatic Margaret herself would have laughed. When Will added wood to the fire, Ranger watched the flames as if studying an ancient enemy that had somehow become family. The cabin was not whole, not yet, but it breathed now. It smelled of cedar smoke, puppy formula, clean towels, and soup Charlotte Reed kept bringing in jars because, as she put it, a man can't live on coffee and stubbornness unless he plans to haunt his own kitchen. Will had started answering the phone again sometimes. He had even washed the windows. That small act would have seemed ridiculous to anyone else, but to him it felt like opening a sealed tomb. Still, healing was not a straight road. It wandered, slipped, doubled back. Some nights, after Ranger fell asleep by the hearth, Will sat alone and touched the old dog tags around his neck, feeling the names of the dead move through him like winter wind through pines. He loved the puppy already. That was the problem. Love had returned not as a trumpet, but as a warm nose against his wrist, and it terrified him. That night, the firewood box beside the hearth ran low just after 10. Will considered leaving it until morning, but the wind had begun to push hard against the cabin walls, and Ranger was still too fragile for a cold room. "Stay," Will told him, pointing with 2 fingers the way he had once commanded trained dogs who could read him better than most men. Ranger lifted his head from Margaret's quilt, one ear folded, brown eyes half sleepy and half insulted. "Don't look at me like that," Will muttered. "You've got one job. Keep the floor from floating away." Ranger gave a tiny huff, not a bark, not even close, just breath with an opinion. Will smiled despite himself, pulled on his coat, and stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight in one hand and an empty canvas carrier in the other. The cold slapped him awake. The yard lay blue-black under the moonless sky, the woodpile a dark shape near the side of the cabin. Ice glazed the steps, but Will moved carefully, favoring his old left knee. That knee had been damaged years ago in a hard landing he never talked about, and his lower back carried its own ancient complaint from an explosion that had thrown him into a stone wall and left him pretending, for 15 years, that pain was only weather in the bones. He reached the woodpile, stacked logs into the carrier, and was turning back when a gust tore through the trees. Somewhere above him, a frozen branch cracked like a rifle shot. Ranger whined inside the cabin. Will glanced toward the glowing window. "Easy, boy," he called. Then his boot slid. The fall was not dramatic at first. No grand cry, no cinematic tumble. Just one treacherous step, one sheet of black ice, and the whole world dropped out from under him. Will hit the ground hard on his hip and shoulder. The carrier flew from his hand. Logs rolled across the snow. Pain flashed white through his back, then down his leg, sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. Before he could move, the loose outer stack of firewood shifted and collapsed, pinning his lower leg beneath several heavy split logs. Not enough to crush bone, perhaps, but enough to trap him against frozen ground. His phone skidded from his coat pocket and landed several feet away, screen glowing uselessly in the snow. He reached for it once, fingers clawing at ice, but the movement sent another blade of pain through his back. He lay still, breathing hard. The cabin door was only 20 feet away. 20 feet. In combat, he had crossed open ground under fire. He had swum black water with gear dragging him downward. He had carried men heavier than himself through smoke. Now 20 feet might as well have been the Red Sea without Moses. Well, he whispered through clenched teeth. "This is undignified." He tried to laugh. It came out as a groan. Inside, Ranger heard something change in the world. The puppy had been dozing beneath Margaret's quilt, wrapped in firelight and the strange new safety of home. At the sound of Will hitting the ground, his head jerked up. His body was still weak from infection and surgery, his bandaged paw still clumsy, but fear moved through him faster than pain. He stumbled to his feet, slipped once on the rug, then limped toward the door. A thin whine came from his throat. Outside, Will heard it faintly and turned his head toward the porch. "Stay inside," he rasped. "Ranger, stay." But Ranger did not understand all human words. He understood tone. He understood absence. He understood that the man who fed him, warmed him, held him through the dark, was no longer where he belonged. The puppy scratched at the bottom of the door. The old latch, which Will had not fully clicked shut against the wind, rattled. Ranger scratched again, harder, his injured paw protesting each movement. He whimpered, backed up, bumped the door with his shoulder, then opened his mouth and released the first real bark of his life. It was small, cracked, and furious, a puppy's battle horn blown before the gates of some frozen kingdom. Will's eyes filled before he could stop them. "That's your first bark?" he muttered. "Now you pick bravery?" Ranger barked again, then again. The latch slipped. The door opened an inch, pushed by wind and desperation. Ranger shoved through the gap and tumbled onto the porch, landing awkwardly on 3 good paws and 1 bandaged miracle. The cold hit him like a wall. For a second, he stood shaking, nose lifted, ears uneven, a small black and tan figure against a night far too large for him. Then he saw Will in the snow. The puppy limped down the icy steps, half sliding, half falling, and reached him with a cry so sharp it cut through Will worse than the cold. Ranger licked his face, his beard, his cheek, frantic and warm. "Easy," Will whispered, though his own teeth had begun to chatter. "I'm here." Ranger pressed his body against Will's neck as if he could warm a grown man by will alone. For a few blessed seconds, Will let himself feel that heat. Then the wind rose, and he knew neither of them could stay there. "Charlotte," he breathed. "Go, boy. Charlotte." He pointed weakly toward the narrow path through the trees, where Charlotte Reed's farmhouse sat less than 200 yards away, its porch light usually left on for no reason except that Charlotte believed darkness got rude when not corrected. Ranger did not go at first. He pawed at Will's coat, then licked his mouth again, trying to pull him back to consciousness each time his eyes drifted. Will forced his hand up and nudged the puppy's shoulder. "Go." Perhaps it was command. Perhaps prayer. Perhaps the old canine blood in that little body recognized the shape of duty before his legs were ready for it. Ranger turned. He stumbled once, recovered, and began limping through the snow toward Charlotte's house, leaving a crooked trail of paw prints behind him. The distance was short for a healthy dog, endless for a wounded puppy. Twice he fell. Once he stopped and looked back toward the cabin, trembling so hard his whole body shook. Then Will groaned in the dark, and Ranger pushed forward again. At Charlotte's porch he threw himself against the steps and barked. The first bark had been cracked. These were stronger, urgent, wild with meaning. Inside, Charlotte Reed woke in her flannel nightgown and thick wool socks, her gray blonde hair loose around her face like storm cloud silver. She was a practical woman, but even practical women know when Mercy is standing at the door making a racket. She opened it and found Ranger shivering on the porch, one white bandage soaked with snow, eyes fixed on her with a terror no animal could fake. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. "Where's Will?" Ranger barked once, turned, and limped down the steps. Charlotte did not waste a second. She grabbed her coat, boots, and phone, dialing 911 as she followed the puppy into the dark. The rescue lights reached the cabin 15 minutes later, red and blue flashing against the trees like stained glass in a storm. Deputy Mark Ellison arrived first, a broad, middle-aged man with dark skin, a shaved head, and a calm baritone voice that made frightened people listen. He had served the county for 20 years and carried himself like a door that would not blow open. Behind him came paramedic Nora Pike, a compact woman in her early 40s with copper-red hair tucked beneath a knit cap, pale green eyes, and the quick, no-nonsense hands of someone who could comfort and command in the same breath. They freed Will's leg, wrapped him in a thermal blanket, checked his pulse, and warned him not to argue, which he immediately tried to do. "My dog," Will rasped. "Get my dog warm." Charlotte stood nearby, clutching Ranger inside her coat, tears shining on her cheeks. "Your dog is the reason we found you, William Harper." When they lifted Will onto the stretcher, Ranger squirmed free from Charlotte and stumbled to him, pressing his small body against Will's chest as if reporting for duty. Nora started to move him, but Will's hand rose weakly over the puppy's back. "Let him stay," he whispered. No one argued. Ranger tucked his nose beneath Will's chin, trembling, exhausted, victorious. Will looked at Charlotte through the swirl of lights and snow. "I thought I saved him," he said. Charlotte wiped her face with her sleeve and gave him the gentlest smile he had ever seen on a battlefield or anywhere else. "Maybe," she said, voice breaking softly, "he was just returning the favor." Spring came slowly to the Blue Ridge, not like a parade, but like a tired nurse opening curtains one window at a time. Snow still clung to the shaded side of Will Harper's cabin, tucked beneath the porch steps and along the fence posts, but the roof had begun to drip in the afternoon, and the creek behind the pines had found its voice again. Will moved carefully now, slower than before the accident, with a brace around his left knee and a stiffness in his lower back that reminded him each morning that pride was a poor substitute for caution. Nora Pike had told him that while tightening the blanket around him in the ambulance, and though Will had grumbled at the time, he had remembered it. A man could survive war, grief, and black ice only so many times before the Lord and his neighbors started taking turns scolding him. Ranger, however, had accepted Will's recovery as a personal assignment. The German Shepherd puppy, now several weeks older and stronger, had grown into his paws just enough to look less like a bundle of mismatched parts and more like a young dog with a destiny. His black and tan coat had thickened into a soft winter sheen, his brown eyes had cleared into bright, watchful intelligence, and one ear had finally decided to stand while the other still leaned slightly sideways, giving him the look of a brave little general who had slept on his helmet. His injured paw remained a touch smaller, and when he ran he carried a gentle limp, but he moved with such determination that no one who saw him pitied him for long. He followed Will from room to room, lying beside the chair when Will rested, watching the door when Charlotte came by, and placing his chin on Will's boot whenever the old seal grew too quiet. The cabin had changed around them. The curtains stayed open. The sink no longer held lonely dishes. Margaret's quilt was folded near the hearth, not like a relic, but like something still useful in the kingdom of the living. The old navy jacket hung beside the door, and Ranger's cracked collar, the one with the mysterious tag, sat on the mantel beneath Margaret's photograph. Will had cleaned the tag until the words could be read clearly. "Last pup of K9 Ranger." He still did not know every detail of the puppy's past, but some mysteries did not need to be solved to be honored. Some were simply doors through which Grace had entered wearing muddy paws. After the night Ranger found help, the town stopped pretending Will Harper was only that quiet man up on Elk Hollow Road. People began to come by. Not in a flood, because mountain people understood distance the way sailors understood weather, but in careful offerings. Charlotte Reed brought soup, biscuits, and once a pecan pie so heavy it seemed constructed for military defense. Doctor. Emma Brooks stopped by twice a week at first, claiming she needed to check Ranger's paw, though Will noticed she stayed long after the bandage was changed, drinking coffee at the kitchen table while Ranger slept under her chair. Henry came with her sometimes, taller every visit, his sandy hair still falling into his eyes, but his hands steadier now when he handled medicine or listened to Ranger's breathing. The boy had begun reading veterinary manuals from Emma's clinic, and he spoke of animal care with the solemn wonder of someone discovering a calling hidden inside himself. "I think I want to do what Aunt Emma does," he told Will one afternoon while Ranger chewed the end of his shoelace. "Help animals?" Will asked. Henry looked down at the puppy. "Help the ones people gave up on." Will did not answer right away. Outside, thaw water slid from the roof in slow, silver threads. "That's good work," he said at last. "Hard work." Henry nodded, then smiled as Ranger tried to drag the shoelace away like a captured enemy. "He makes it look worth it." Will looked at the puppy and thought of the ice road, the ditch, the tiny breath almost swallowed by snow. He does that. By early April, Ranger no longer needed the bandage. Emma removed the final wrap at the cabin, kneeling near the hearth while Ranger sat very still, as if accepting knighthood. The paw looked imperfect, a little narrowed where the toe had been taken, but the skin was healed, clean and strong. Emma ran her thumb gently over it and nodded. "He'll always have a slight limp," she said, "but it won't stop him." Will gave a short laugh. "Nothing stops him except bath water and the vacuum." Emma smiled, and in that smile Will saw the quiet grief she carried for her own lost husband, and the quiet courage she had built around it. She was not replacing Margaret. No one could. But she was a living friend at his table, and that mattered. Charlotte stood near the counter pouring coffee into mismatched mugs, pretending not to watch the look that passed between them. Henry stood by the window with his phone, waiting for Ranger to do something heroic enough to photograph. Ranger, sensing an audience, sneezed and fell sideways into Margaret's quilt. "Majestic," Henry said. Will shook his head. "That dog came from a working K9 line, and this is what we got." Charlotte lifted her mug. "A hero with bad timing is still a hero." Emma reached into her bag then and pulled out a folder. The mood in the room shifted before anyone spoke. Will knew paperwork when he saw it. He had spent half his life signing forms that sent men into danger or brought them home under flags. Emma laid the folder on the kitchen table. "Animal Control finished the notice period," she said. "No owner came forward. The old Blue Ridge working dog's records were incomplete. The breeder passed away, the facility closed, and no one has legal claim to him now." Will looked at Ranger, who had crawled beneath the table and was busy placing his nose on Will's boot. Emma opened the folder. "If you sign these adoption papers, he's yours, officially." The cabin became very still. Will stared at the line where his name belonged. William Harper, owner. The word looked too simple for what it meant. Owner sounded like property, and Ranger had never felt like property. He had felt like a mission at first, then a burden gladly carried, then a heartbeat the house had borrowed to remember its own. Will's hand did not move. To sign meant to love without pretending there was a safe distance. To sign meant accepting that one day, because all living things follow that old road, he might lose Ranger too. His chest tightened. He heard Margaret's voice from some warm room in memory. "Don't let sorrow turn you into a house with no windows." He heard old Ranger's final breath. He heard this Ranger's first bark cracking open the winter night. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this," he said quietly. Emma did not ask what this meant. Neither did Charlotte. They knew. Ranger stood then, as if the silence itself had called him. He placed his healed but altered paw on Will's boot, then stretched upward until his nose brushed the dog tags hanging against Will's chest. The tags swung softly, touching the puppy's forehead like a blessing. Will looked down at him, and the last wall inside him, the one he had mistaken for strength, gave way without a sound. He picked up the pen and signed his name. No thunder shook the mountains. No choir descended through the rafters. The miracle was smaller and better. Charlotte cried into a dish towel and denied it. Henry took a picture at exactly the wrong moment, catching Will blinking and Ranger licking the adoption folder. Emma laughed, warm and surprised, and Will realized he had not heard enough laughter in his kitchen. Later that afternoon, he opened the cabin door. Spring air moved in, smelling of wet earth, pine sap, and the first brave grass beneath melting snow. Ranger stepped onto the porch, paused as if remembering the night he had crossed this same threshold into danger, then bounded down into the yard with his crooked, joyful run. His paws left small prints in the damp ground where snow had finally surrendered. Charlotte stood by the fence, arms folded, smiling with the satisfaction of a woman whose soup had helped save a kingdom. Emma leaned against her truck, hair touched by sunlight, watching Ranger with the calm pride of a healer who knew when to let life run on its own legs. Henry crouched near the porch, taking photos, laughing when Ranger charged at a melting snow pile and came away with a muddy nose. Will stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the other around his dog tags. The cabin behind him glowed with firelight, coffee, clean blankets, and the quiet breath of belonging. He had thought he brought Ranger home to save him from the cold, but as the puppy ran back and pressed against his leg, Will understood the truth at last. Ranger had brought him home from a winter far deeper than snow, from a battlefield no map could mark, from the lonely country inside his own heart. Will bent down, touched the young dog's head, and whispered, "Welcome home, son." Ranger looked up, one ear crooked, eyes shining, and barked once, clear and proud, as if answering for both of them. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder, shining clouds, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes it comes trembling in the snow, wrapped in weakness, wearing tired eyes and a wounded paw. Will thought he was saving Ranger from the cold, but in truth, that little German Shepherd puppy was sent to rescue him from a colder place, the winter inside his own heart. And maybe that is how God's grace often works in our daily lives. It does not always come as something grand. It may come through a neighbor bringing soup, a doctor who refuses to give up, a small animal that needs our care, or one quiet moment that reminds us we are still needed in this world. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, or simply write Ranger if you believe love can still find us in our darkest season. And if you want more stories of kindness, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join this growing family. May God bless you, protect your home, comfort your heart, and place a small miracle on your path when you need it most.